an American military helicopter flew 250 kilometers off the Venezuelan coast. Meanwhile, 3 destroyers equipped with missile systems crossed the waters just below. All this happened because Nicolas Maduro decided to challenge the military and announced the mobilization of military and civilian forces at 284 strategic points across Venezuela, calling them the combat front. Tensions are high in the Caribbean Sea, and the smallest misstep could turn a routine operation into an international incident with unpredictable consequences. In the last 30 days, the Southern Caribbean has turned into a real military chessboard. On one side, the United States sent what they call an anti-drug operation, 3 destroyer ships, the USS Iwo Jima, USS Fort Lauderdale, and USS San Antonio, carrying 4,000 Marines and sailors. On the other side, Venezuela responded with what Maduro baptized as Independence Plan 200, involving not only the regular armed forces, but also up to 4.5 million civilian militiamen. The escalation officially began in August when Washington announced the deployment of the amphibious force to the Caribbean. But it was on September 2nd that everything changed. Trump and Marco Rubio publicly announced a lethal strike against a vessel that, according to them, was carrying illicit substances coming from Venezuela. The result, 11 people dead and a diplomatic crisis that keeps growing. The most recent episode that turned the heat up even more happened just a few days ago when a U.S. Navy MH-60, our Seahawk helicopter, was photographed flying close to Caracas International Airport. For many analysts, this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated show of capability and presence. When Donald Trump got up on stage to announce the naval strike, his words were blunt. "We carried out a successful operation against traffickers who use Venezuelan territory to poison American families." For Washington, the narrative is simple and easy to sell to the domestic audience. Protect American citizens from the scourge of illicit substances flowing through Caribbean corridors. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, was even more specific, describing the operation as necessary to dismantle criminal networks that operate with impunity. The American message to the world is clear. We're fighting crime, not provoking a country. On the Venezuelan side, the rhetoric took on tones we haven't heard in years. Maduro, in a national address that lasted almost an hour, declared that American imperialism shows its claws, but will find a people prepared to defend their land. He didn't stop there. The Venezuelan president called on all patriots to organize into vigilance cells and promised that nobody touches this land without consequences. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez was more technical, but just as firm. 284 strategic points are being fortified right now, including refineries, ports, airports, and borders. Caracas' message is just as clear. We're not passive victims. We're a sovereign state defending itself. On the morning of September 2nd, Donald Trump made an announcement that would echo for weeks. 11 people died in a strike on a vessel transporting drugs in Venezuela. But that simple phrase hides one of the most controversial operations in the Caribbean in recent years. According to the American version, the crew was made up of members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, which the U.S. has designated as a terrorist organization. Trump wrote on Truth Social, "This morning, under my orders, the U.S. Armed Forces conducted a kinetic strike against Tren de Aragua narco-terrorists." The term kinetic strike is military jargon for using lethal force in a targeted way. But what happened next turned to military operation into a diplomatic crisis. Trump decided to do something unprecedented. He published a video of the strike on his social media. The footage, apparently filmed from a military aircraft, shows a speedboat being hit by projectiles and later sinking in Caribbean waters. The Venezuelan response was immediate and devastating for the American narrative. The Venezuelan government accused the U.S. of creating the video using artificial intelligence. Venezuelan Communications Minister Freddy Nanez was blunt. This video was artificially generated to justify an unjustifiable military escalation. The controversy took on a fascinating technical dimension. When the video was submitted to AI detection tools, some flagged it as highly likely to have been created by AI. But U.S. Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth fired back on Fox News. "I saw it live. We knew who was on that boat and what they represented. That was Tren de Aragua." Reuters, one of the world's most respected news agencies, carried out its own technical investigation and found no clear evidence of digital manipulation, but it also couldn't independently verify the authenticity of the footage. What makes this episode even more complicated is the lack of official details. U.S. authorities didn't explain exactly what the vessel was carrying, limiting themselves to saying it was transporting a lot of drugs. No mention of the amount seized, type of substance, or estimated value, information normally released in successful anti-drug operations. Trump's choice to publish the video also raises questions. In regular military operations, footage of lethal strikes is classified and rarely made public, especially when deaths are involved. The decision to release it publicly was interpreted by analysts as an attempt to show strength and legitimize the operation for the American public. For Venezuela, the response was to mobilize troops to the southern Caribbean and 15,000 soldiers to the Colombian border. Maduro also launched a massive enlistment campaign for the Bolivarian National Militia, turning a one-off operation into justification for national mobilization. The problem isn't just the facts, it's how each side interprets and uses them politically. For the Americans, it was a successful operation against an international terrorist group. For the Venezuelans, it was an act of aggression showing Washington's true military intentions. For the international community, it's a dangerous precedent for how anti-drug operations can morph into military actions with geopolitical implications. Independent investigators still haven't had access to the wreckage, the bodies, or physical evidence of the cargo, making it impossible to objectively assess what really happened that day in the Caribbean Sea. This lack of transparency fuels conspiracy theories on both sides and makes a factual, evidence-based analysis nearly impossible. Maduro's reaction to the increased American presence wasn't just rhetoric, it was strategic and broad. The Independence Plan 200 isn't just a flashy name, it's a mobilization program that's turning Venezuela into something close to a state preparing for conflict. The 284 points include critical facilities, oil refineries that sustain the Venezuelan economy, ports that control international trade, airports that connect the country to the world, and border stretches that have historically been porous. Each of these points now has regular military presence combined with civilian militias receiving weapons and basic training. But maybe the most striking thing is the human scale. Maduro talked about mobilizing up to 4.5 million people. That's nearly 15% of Venezuela's population. These aren't just numbers on paper. On the streets of Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia, you can actually see groups of civilians organized into patrols, wearing vests identifying them as defenders of the homeland. For military analysts, this strategy serves two purposes. First, creating real surveillance and response capacity that makes any American operation on Venezuelan soil extremely complicated. Second, politically consolidating support for the government through a common external enemy. The most shocking revelation of recent days came straight from Maduro. The only two diplomatic communication channels between Caracas and Washington have been ruined. The first channel involved John McNamara, a career American diplomat known for his experience in Latin American crises. The second worked through unidentified intermediaries, possibly third countries willing to mediate. The breakdown of these channels means that, for the first time since the start of Trump's administration, there are no institutional mechanisms to avoid misunderstandings between the two powers. That makes any military incident much more dangerous, since there's no way to quickly clarify intentions. But here's the paradox defining this crisis. In the same speech where he announced the rupture of diplomatic channels, Maduro made a direct appeal to Trump to restart negotiations from scratch. He specifically said, "President Trump, you have in your hands how to avoid a tragedy in the Caribbean. Don't let your advisors lead you down a road of no return." Analysts see this strategy as a desperate attempt to create division inside the American government. Maduro is betting that Trump, who's always boasted about being a great deal-maker, might want to take personal control of the situation, sidelining figures like Marco Rubio, who push for more aggressive solutions. The irony is that both Trump and Maduro face internal pressures to show strength. Trump needs to show tangible results in the fight against drugs for his electoral base, while Maduro uses the external threat to shore up internal support amid Venezuela's devastating economic crisis. The flight of the American MH-60, our helicopter over waters near Venezuela, might have lasted only a few hours, but its message echoed for weeks. International relations experts recognize the pattern. When a military power flies close to another country's borders, it's rarely by accident. The Seahawk that flew about 250 kilometers off the Venezuelan coast carried electronic surveillance equipment capable of intercepting communications and mapping military installations. For the Venezuelans, this wasn't reconnaissance, it was espionage. For the Americans, it was a routine operation in international waters. Geographic proximity makes everything more complicated. Unlike tensions between countries separated by oceans, here we're talking about waters where Venezuelan fishermen work daily, where trade routes connect Caribbean islands, and where a navigation mistake could put a vessel into contested territory. Pilots on both sides operate under rules of engagement designed for open confrontation scenarios, not this gray zone where anti-drug operations mix with military shows of force. But while politicians in Washington and Caracas give speeches in air-conditioned rooms, it's coastal communities that feel the real impact of this escalation. Venezuelan fishermen report their boats are intercepted more and more often, sometimes by American patrols, other times by Venezuelan forces paranoid about any suspicious move. Maria Gonzalez, a fisherwoman from La Guaira, sums it up: "Before, our biggest fear was the storm. Now, we're scared of any ship that shows up on the horizon." She's not exaggerating. Local reports show fishing activity in the region has dropped 40% since the military tension rose. Tourism, a vital income source for nearby Caribbean islands, is also taking a hit. Cruise companies have canceled routes through the region, and airlines are avoiding routes crossing airspace near the operations zone. On the American side, families of military personnel deployed to the operation live with the anxiety of knowing their loved ones are working in one of the most tense regions in the Western Hemisphere. This isn't a routine deployment, it's a mission where each day could bring an unexpected escalation. Scenario 1. De-escalation through diplomacy. This is the most optimistic scenario, but also the least likely in the short term. It would involve mediation from countries like Brazil, Colombia, or Mexico, creation of direct communication channels between Washington and Caracas, and agreements on rules of engagement to prevent incidents. The problem is that both sides have gained domestic political capital from the current confrontational stance, making it hard to justify backing down to their bases. Scenario 2. Limited clashes with international containment. This is probably the most realistic scenario. It would involve sporadic episodes of interceptions, warnings, and maybe even small armed clashes, but with both sides working to avoid full-scale escalation. The international community, especially Latin American countries, would put pressure to keep incidents localized. It's a dangerous scenario, but manageable. Scenario 3. Escalation to regional confrontation. This is the scenario everyone fears, but few admit publicly. It would involve a serious incident, maybe an American warship attacked or a Venezuelan base bombed, forcing both sides into broader military responses. Neighboring countries would be pushed to choose sides, turning a bilateral tension into a hemispheric crisis. The likelihood of each scenario changes daily, depending on factors like public opinion, pressure, reactions from the international community, and critically, the ability of leaders on both sides to resist the temptation to use military force to solve political problems. Off-the-record talks with defense analysts in Washington and Latin American think tanks reveal concerns that don't show up in official statements. On the American side, there's acknowledgement that a broad military operation against Venezuela would be extremely complicated, not just because of geography, but also because of the civil resistance Maduro has managed to organize. On the Venezuelan side, there's awareness that despite all the rhetoric, the country doesn't have the military capacity to directly confront the United States. The Venezuelan strategy seems to be making any American operation so costly in human and political terms that Washington looks for other alternatives. Brazilian analysts who watch the situation closely for regional security reasons believe both sides are trapped in their own narratives. Trump needs to show results in the drug war for his electoral base. Maduro needs the external threat to consolidate support amid the economic crisis. The real danger, according to these experts, isn't a deliberate decision for confrontation, but a miscalculation, an incident that forces both sides to react in ways that make stepping back impossible. This isn't just another distant geopolitical tension. The effects are already being felt in fuel prices, international trade routes, and the stability of the entire Caribbean region. If the situation escalates, countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana could be forced to deal with massive refugee flows. For the United States, a prolonged confrontation in Venezuela would represent the biggest military challenge in the Western Hemisphere since the invasion of Panama in 1989. For Venezuela, it would mean total isolation and possible state collapse. But maybe more important is the precedent this crisis could set. If military powers can use anti-drug operations as justification for military presence near sovereign countries, where does it end? If countries can mobilize civilian populations to confront foreign forces, what kind of conflicts could that spark in the future? The answer to those questions is being written right now, in the warm waters of the Caribbean Sea, where every decision made by a ship captain, a helicopter pilot, or militia commander could redefine the balance of power in an entire region. What happens between the United States and Venezuela in the coming months won't just determine the fate of those two countries. It will set the rules of the game for 21st century conflicts. Today, while you watch this video, ships from two nations sail the same sea, separated by just a few dozen kilometers and by completely different interpretations of what counts as self-defense. Helicopters patrol skies where the smallest communication failure could turn into an international tragedy. This is the new reality of the Caribbean. A sea that for centuries was a route of trade and tourism has now become a field where rival narratives about sovereignty, security, and national dignity clash every single day. The next time you hear about an anti-drug operation or national defense exercises, remember, behind the technical terms are real people, entire communities, and decisions that can change the course of history. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't if there will be a confrontation, it's if we can avoid it becoming inevitable.